slide there.
I should have brought some along.
Yeah.
We could have done them while we're in this meeting. It's not that hard. I'm unashamedly pro-density. I think we need a denser city. I think we need to do density done well, and I think we need to do it much better than we're doing it. But we shouldn't simply say that density itself is wrong. The one thing I can agree with Premier Minns about is that he's said when he became Premier that we shouldn't be adding a new street to the perimeter of the city every week. But he is. And he's not only filling the county of Cumberland Plain, the land of the Eora and the Gadigal people, with housing, with sprawl, wall to wall. We're actually going beyond that down to Wallandilly if you go down towards Canberra. So that is a problem. We are the biggest wasters of urban land or land. We've got a whole continent and we can't even use it properly. So we need to do so much better. And density is undeniably part of that mix. Better cities. I do want to talk about the alphabet soup of policies. So you'll all be used to, everyone's going to talk about these ones. So HDA, TOD, LMR, AIH, SDA, you've all got those? We have a little quiz, I'll go through them. HDA is the Housing Delivery Authority. This is such a misnomer because they don't necessarily deliver housing, they deliver development consents. In fact, they don't deliver them, all they do is actually give a slipstream for them. And they're not an authority, they're just three people who sit in an office and rubber stamp things. So the whole concept is wrong. It's basically a new version of Part 3A and all those other mechanisms which state governments have been bringing in our working life. And of course, it's really tailored to big developers. And so it really promotes towers, which are the most intrusive, most expensive, not only to build, but also to live in for the life of the building for all the people who are going to live in there. So it's the worst way of doing density, and you only need to go to central Melbourne. I think, Elizabeth, one of your slides was central Melbourne to see all this black, purple glass everywhere. TODs should be a good policy, transit-oriented development. And you look at it, there's a separate map. So Elizabeth showed you the LMR, which I'll come to. TODs should have been practiced in Sydney. In fact, they go back to the county of Cumberland in a way, which had these centres across the metropolitan area. The key thing with TODs is they're building on the existing rail network, which is built between 100 and 170 years ago. That showed the foresight of previous generations to actually build infrastructure, and Sydney was one of the great public transport cities in the world up to the construction of the Harbour Bridge. We've had a little bit glimmer that we could be that again with the recent projects. But really we need to be building more public transport. So if you look at the Sydney plan, anyone seen the Sydney plan that the Premier's announced? One person. And how many new metro lines and tram lines does it have? That many. They're talking about Western Sydney rapid buses. So you're finding a complete loss of the thing that everyone loves about the recent development of Sydney, which is our high quality public transport. And I should call out to Jason in the room, who's actually one of the design leaders of the metro. So TODs is in principle a good policy, but is the detail good? And it's not actually forward looking because we're not actually building those places and we've got too much of a propensity for towers. LMR should be a really good policy, low to medium rise policy, 4 to 6 stories. It should be, that actually should be the scale. I am going to criticise all of the inner city councils, and I've worked with all of them and in all of them, that too many of their policies are unchanged since 1979 and the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and they enforce 3 stories and all of their DCPs are biased towards making things pretend to look like houses rather than actually embrace better quality apartment buildings. But this policy, of course, should have had affordability built into it. It's the one that should have had affordable housing, 30% of income in perpetuity, because it was already an uplift in land. And of course, then it's jackpotted by people don't use this one, AIH, affordable infill housing, which are the bonuses that Elizabeth talked about. So on 4 stories, you can go up to about 5.5. On 6 stories, you can go up to 8 or 9, depending on the site. And of course, as Elizabeth explained, only 15% affordable housing for only 15 years. In fact, it's lower than the previous affordability measures which were in place. Now, of course, what's also wrong with all these policies is they're just gifting people like us and developers, existing landowners, have just got an enormous windfall profit. How is this helping intergenerational equity? You had the gall of the Treasurer to get up and say, you know, Sydney's going to lose children because of your policies. Because your policy is actually biased and they're not delivering affordable housing, because we know across Western Sydney we're not getting any apartment buildings, and all the examples are exactly what Elizabeth said. You're knocking down smaller, more affordable accommodation to get bigger buildings with less occupancy and more cars and more bulk. That is a huge problem all across Sydney, and that is the problem in the inner city suburbs. And there needs to be policy. City of Sydney has a policy, Waverley's adopted it, so you can't reduce the density. But what also happens in those buildings is you have less occupants. And occupancy rates is something that needs to be talked about. Occupancy rates have been falling all of our lifetime. In 1900, there were 5 people per dwelling. Now they're about you can argue about this, 2.5 to 2.2. And of course, all of those bigger, expensive developments, you're lucky to have 1.8. Because usually one person's in the process of dying, because they're the only people who can afford the buildings. So all of these policies deliver windfall profits to existing landowners and developers. And that is not good for the city. It's not good for society. There is one 3-word acronym which I think is under threat, which is the ADG, the Apartment Design Guide. So this is a policy that Bob Carr brought in when he was Premier. He was driving on an Anzac Parade and he finally noticed how ugly the buildings were. He picked a Meriton building and he did something about it. And so he brought in this policy. It had previous names, but I think it's the best planning policy that's been in existence in Australia. It's been roughly it used to be called CEP 65 as well. People know it by that name. It's almost the only planning policy I know of which actually says what you should do, what's good, and that enforces what's good with environmental policies. But it's under threat. It's been continually white-handed by the development industry, even some architects shamefully, white-handing this policy, and it's actually decades ahead of other jurisdictions. Only Western Australia has matched it. Victoria, the home of shocking apartments, slum apartments, they've got a new policy, or their most recent policy, having had none, is called appropriately BADS. They think it stands for Better Apartment Design. BADS is right. That's what it is. But you know, the rest of Australia's got nothing. South Australia doesn't have any controls whatsoever. You can build any old rubbish. There's just nothing at all there. But the 3 loopholes we have to fix with the ADG, because what's happened is the buildings have got so much bigger during the life of this policy, is it doesn't have any tower controls. It should have footprint controls so that you don't get these enormous buildings. It needs to think about its solar access, because we're getting all these terrible all-glass buildings which actually will cook. Buildings in central Melbourne, people will die in those buildings because you only get a window that opens that much. If the power goes down, those buildings are a furnace. And then we also, and this was cut out of the ADG, need proper deep soil landscape controls and trees. Too many apartments are being built today without proper landscape. So those things need to be strengthened, not watered down. Some myths about Sydney planning. Yes, it's deeply flawed. I'm a great critic of Sydney planning. But, you know, too often in the press, lazily they talk about approvals. That doesn't matter at all. That's land speculation. What matters is completions. And so the next time you hear somebody talk about, all the approvals, it's just hot air. If you don't actually build them, you're not doing anything to address the problem other than your own windfall speculative profit on the land, and that's not in anyone else's interest. And so many upzonings are like that. We need to think about things like inclusionary zoning, which is whenever you change the density, you increase the public payback. And the public payback is the key thing that we're missing here. You can't simply increase the density without increasing all the services that we talked about before. And in particular, public space. You need to make places more amenable, more walkable. You need to have lots of interesting places to go to, and I don't just mean shops. You need to have actually the public dividend as part of that. And we don't have a planning system. We've got a properly development rights system, because it's the Minister for Public Space is actually in his title, and he never does anything about public space. And that's a huge problem with the whole training of planners and the conception of practicing planners. So we need to really rewrite the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act and planning culture. But the people who really you shouldn't listen to at all are the economists. They have far too loud a voice on housing. When was the last time you heard one of them criticise the banks or tax? They're all completely looking, oh, look over there, look at planning, let's bash them because they're actually a weak target, rather than looking at their own discipline. Why can't we have things like housing co-ops in Australia, which are commonplace overseas? Well, because the banks won't lend to them. Why don't we get any discussion about that? They're always talking about speculative windfall profit. They're not talking about genuinely making housing more affordable. I hate this NIMBY-YIMBY thing. The last time I said that, Peter Tulip was the godfather of YIMBYs, was actually in the audience. I did point him out. But am I getting the wind up?
No.
I particularly want to single out not only the Treasurer, but one of the Treasurer's key advisory panels, the New South Wales Productivity Commission. You really have to wonder where they're coming from, and the Australian one's not much better. When I asked them about inclusionary zoning, 600-page report, half a page. They don't understand the value of land. They don't understand the unique qualities of housing as opposed to bananas or any other commodity. But I'll read you from section 4.6.1.5 from the Productivity Commission. Let consumers decide how much solar access they want to pay for. I could read the whole thing, but it'll go too long. They say solar access requirements are at odds with Australia and New South Wales' national goal of building more well-located homes. So you don't have the right to sunshine, according to them. Regulators should be mindful of what perceptions of disamenities may vary. The shade provided by high-rise buildings can actually benefit residents and visitors. That's not the worst of it. Consumers are well placed to choose how much solar access they are willing to pay for, as if lots of people in terms of affordability can choose what they pay for when housing is so expensive. Research also suggests that shadier apartments, great term, thanks Productivity Commission, can have benefits like reducing the risk of melanoma. I didn't write this. And cooling costs in summer. It's online, you can get it and tell it where it should go. But housing costs aren't caused by planning, they're caused by tax, they're caused by banks, they're caused by all these other regulations, and they're particularly caused by the unsexy things that happens the day after the DA is approved. The amount of regulation post-DA has more than doubled in the last 10 years, and the cost before you get to construction, the cost of what's called construction documentation has gone up by about 30 or 40%, but it favours towers over any smaller development if you don't have a harbour view. And so, in fact, we're not getting the diversity of housing. It's not just density, it's also diversity. We want to provide people with a maximum number of choices of where they might want to live, not simply having cost as the only vector. It's a big unsexy topic, it's a topic for another day, but you can look to the National Construction Code, Australian Standard and the like. So I'll just leave you with this question. In a country so obsessed with real estate and with such exorbitant housing costs, why do we have such a poor standard of design and construction?